In the 10th chapter, we read about the symbolic executions, and there's an interesting statement in a verse which I want you to look at, please, in verse 8. While they were killing and I was left alone. I want you to think on those words, I was left. Have you ever wondered why you have been left to your present age? You know the most dangerous thing that ever took place in our experience? Being born. Being born. All sorts of things could then have happened that could have made our life 1,000 times more difficult than it is. But in the early years of life, there are 1,000 dangers. If you think back on your childhood and some of the things you used to do on scooters or bicycles or mountain climbing or swimming in dangerous places, you know, there are 1,000 gates to death. And the only certain thing in this life is uncertainty. And the only permanent thing in this world is God and what belongs to Him. Nothing else is permanent. And everything's very uncertain. So it says, He was left. He was left. Why have we been left? Maturity has its quicksands, its shoals, its dangers. Recently I watched a documentary on the Crimean War. It did not show the most significant part, but it alluded to it. You remember the Battle of Balaclava? In the Battle of Balaclava, the Light Brigade, immortalised by Tennyson in the poem we learned at school, The Charge of the Light Brigade, it was sent racing in the wrong direction. So here were the top soldiers of Britain dispatched in the wrong direction towards an entrenched Russian site that was massively defended. And if you've ever seen a movie representing the charge of the Light Brigade, the impression you get is how so many men are falling off their horses, shot, and the few survivors keep going. Well, life is a bit like the Battle of Balaclava, because every one of us here knows many people no longer with them. I have on occasion buried motorcyclists, and so I have always said that a person who is careless on a motorbike is a temporary Australian. And seeing I had two, I have to be careful just what I say, but people who are careless on motorbikes are temporary Australians. I think of students I've taught that are dead. Pastor and Mrs. Crabtree and Jill and I have known many former ministers that are dead. Why are we left? I want to tell you a story. There was a favourite with F.W. Boreham, one of the last students at Spurgeon's College before Spurgeon died. He went to New Zealand, had 3 great pastorates, wrote about 50 books, introduced by Billy Graham as the man whose stories are in all our sermons and whose books are on all our shelves. I have about 30 of them. Here's a story he loved to tell about Roy Blackburn, who worked hard, this young man, at his office, came home late, been stock taking, let himself in with his key, and the landlady had left some hot cocoa and some cakes. And as he was sipping the cocoa and eating the cakes, he saw a paper on the floor. He picked it up, and this is what it had. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. Bear was spelt B-A-R-E, yoke Y-O-A-K, and youth was spelt Y-O-O-T-H. And he realised that the landlady's daughter, having been given a Sunday school text, was writing it out. And here was the text. It's good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. It comes from Lamentations, chapter 3. Well, Roy's quite tired and he falls asleep. And suddenly he sees someone in the chair opposite him, and it's him but older. Hair beginning to go grey. And he sees a woman moving around him, and he realises it's his girlfriend but older, Aggie. Then as he watches, there's a metamorphosis, and the figure in the opposite chair changes again. Now is much older. And now there are a lot of young people around, and one of them's carrying a little baby. He watches again, and now there's just an old man in a chair. And he looks at this old man and he hears him murmuring, "I'm too old to work and I'm too proud to beg." And Roy notices that the old man's clothes are very decrepit and the man looks very sad. So in his dream, he says to this figure, "Oh man, you look miserable. Haven't you got anyone to care for you?" And the figure in the chair replies, "Only you." Roy shakes his head and then he says, "Old man, you look neglected. Haven't you got anyone to care for you?" And the man in the chair says, "Only you." Once more he asks the question, "Old man, you are very old. You look very weak. Soon you're going to die. Who is going to bury you?" And the voice comes back, "Only you." Well, then he wakes up. And the next day, as he's off to work, he notices it's springtime. He realises that the year bears the yoke in its youth. In springtime and summertime, nature's making provision for the coming of winter. When he gets at work and he's working on the books of the firm, he realises that his firm tries to bear the yoke because here's provision for depreciation, etc., etc. He goes to see Aggie and she greets him with a kiss and he says, "Aggie, I have been thinking I've got to change some things." But anyway, they go to church. And to his surprise, the old minister selects as his text, "It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth." And the old minister says, "When we are young, we must bear the burden of restraint so that in old age we do not face the burden of remorse. When we are young, we must take up the burden of achievement so that in old age we do not bear the burden of shame." He says in our early years, it is our duty to provide for what we will be in our later years. And then the old minister says, "May I remind you that our Lord Jesus said, 'My yoke is easy and my burden is light.'" And Borum says at the end of this story, from that day, Roy Blackburn and Aggie, who was to become his wife, date their felicity. But the lesson is clear when the book of Lamentations says, good to bear the yoke in one's youth. While we have opportunity, while we still have strength, while we still have energy, while we still have time, the future will come. There's no preventing it. We do get older. People may say, "Hey, you don't look a day older than when I saw you years ago." The answer is their eyesight has deteriorated. Yeah. There is no avoiding the burdens of old age except making provision for them while we still have vitality, while we are left.